Happy Sunday, everyone. Welcome to another Sunday Musing. Hope you are all doing great and having a wonderful Sunday, Easter, resurrection-themed Sabbath worship and all the rest. Today's topic is, I'll say, somewhat related. We're talking about, just like with Jesus rising up from death in the resurrection, we're talking about today what that means for us to rise up from the problems that besiege us and separate us from God. In particular, going to talk about the men. Of course, much of what I'll say, probably everything of what I'll say applies equally to the women, but for reasons that I will now explain, I'm going to be focused just on the men. And that is because tomorrow is the official launch of my latest book titled Rise Up, A Call to Action for Men of God. You can find that book on Amazon. If you just search my name and the words Rise Up, you'll find it. You can also get it at socialharmony.org, which is where you can find all of my religious books. This is a book that I have written as a call to action for men of God, as it says, for a Latter-day Saint male audience, about what it means for us to rise up. What does that actually mean? Now, this book is really a book-length treatment of a familiar hymn that all of us know well. Here is the men's choir at a general conference singing. I'll share just the first verse just to bring us all back up to speed.
Rise up, O men of God, have done with lesser things. Give heart and soul and mind and strength to serve the King of Kings.
Now, as I said, the book that I have written basically is a book-length version of the entire hymn. I'll share some of the other lyrics, including an omitted third verse, in just a moment. That has its own interesting story. But first, I want to give a little bit of a background about how this hymn came to be. It's actually has its origins in the Presbyterian denomination. In 1908, the Presbyterian sect formed what they called the Brotherhood. And this was something that at the time many denominations were doing, as forming kind of men's groups. It was a reaction of a sort to the suffrage movement and women forming all these women's groups trying to fight for, female equality, as they put it, and all the rest. And so there was this like female focus. And so there were a lot of men that were like, well, wait a minute, like we're feeling left out. We need a group of our own. And so the Presbyterians, among others, started this brotherhood concept. So 1908, they held their first conference. And there was a committee of Presbyterian pastors that described what had led them to organize together. They said, "The call is made for the organization of men. The men of our church, as a class, are failing to the rear of the great host of God in both service and benevolence. This occurs largely because they're not organized into associations as the women are. To evangelize men, to pray and labor for their salvation, is the need of the hour, second to no other call in the sphere of Christian work." Now, at the time, there was a Presbyterian newspaper, and a gentleman named Nolan Best was its editor. He was a member of this brotherhood, and actually at the fourth annual conference of the brotherhood, he gave a speech in which, here's just a snippet of what he said: "How we have felt the importance of teaching the men in our community the Bible, practically as it relates to 20th century life. How we have felt the stress of promoting this men and religion forward movement in our towns. How we have felt the absolute, the essential importance of a personal evangelism, man to man. How we have felt the importance of this as it touches the saving of the whole man. How we have been stirred with the determination to do something for the boys of the community. Now let us do it." So Nolan Best, decided that what the Brotherhood really needed was, in order to unify around a common cause, was a song, a hymn, to serve as sort of a rallying cry. So he turned to William Merrill. William Merrill was a Presbyterian pastor, and he was tasked, you might say, or invited by Nolan Best to produce a poem that could be the basis for a hymn. And so Merrill, after reflection, said, suddenly this hymn came up almost without conscious thought or effort. What we now know today as Rise Up, O Men of God. It was published in Best's periodical. From there, it quickly spread. It was adopted by Christian men in a variety of denominations. So I will now read the lyrics. As I said, there is an omitted third verse here that is unfamiliar to the vast majority of Latter-day Saints who are at least familiar with the hymn itself. So, verse 1, rise up, O men of God, have done with lesser things. Give heart and mind and soul and strength to serve the King of Kings. That's what we heard from that choir. Here's verse 2. Rise up, O men of God, his kingdom tarries long. Bring in the day of brotherhood and end the night of wrong. Here's the omitted third verse from the LDS hymnal. Rise up, O men of God, the church for you doth wait. Her strength unequal to her task. Rise up and make her great. More on that in just a moment. Verse 4, lift high the cross of Christ, tread where his feet have trod. As brothers of the Son of Man, rise up, O men of God. Now, we can advance various theories, as I do in my new book, about why the LDS Church why they actually did omit that third verse, which says that the church for you doth wait, her strength is unequal to her task. You know, granted, this was just some Presbyterian pastor putting these words together. It's not like they're all kind of totally blessed from God. So some LDS church leader at some point might have felt, well, it's unflattering to say that the Lord's restored church waits for people and that her strength is unequal to her task and that we need others to rise up and make her great. I have a lot of thoughts about that. Nevertheless, it's omitted. In fact, President Hinckley, at one point, he's talking about this hymn, and he says, like, oh, I grew up, singing this as a boy, and I've known it my whole life, and only recently did I realize there was a whole third verse that was, missing from our hymnal. Now, I wrote this book, Rise Up, for men, specifically because I feel like, and I don't really feel like, I know, I observe that manhood is under attack, that in a kind of postmodern, feminist saturated world, masculinity is under siege. And so at the beginning of the book, I kind of lay out the landscape of how masculinity is under attack. For example, a few years ago, there was a study that found that men are less likely than women to adopt protective behaviors like wearing masks. This is in the context of COVID. And in the years since, there have been 3 additional studies that arrived at the same conclusion. Here's what one of the authors of that study said. Masculine toughness is consistently related to higher negative feelings and lower positive feelings about mask wearing. So the title of this study was, and I quote, Toxic Masculinity, M-A-S-K, because this was in the context of talking about we need to do our part and be a good global citizen and wear masks. So they called it Toxic Masculinity. Subtitle, The Link Between Masculine Toughness and Effective Reactions to Mask Wearing in the COVID-19 Era. And so, why the predominantly male resistance to compliance with the mask? Well, across academia, entertainment, media, politics, and I share other examples like Arnold Schwarzenegger, screw your freedom, wear the mask, like all these people, right? They all seem to converge around the same thesis as this studies or multiple studies authors, which was so-called toxic masculinity. For example, there was a headline in the New York Times that declared to its readers how an aversion to masks stems from toxic masculinity. And so you get this linkage around like pro-social behavior, right? Oh, this is the right thing to do. And why do all these men, why are they so unwilling to comply and do what they're told? Oh, it must be because of toxic masculinity. And certainly masks are just one tiny little data point and anecdote that illustrate this problem, right? For those who want to denigrate men and attack masculinity. Here, do you remember this? I'm going to play this whole, I think, like 90-second clip. Not clip, it's an advertisement from Gillette. This is in the wake of the Me Too era. Believe women, period, without exception. Believe it, Me Too, men are so horrible, toxic masculinity. And then Gillette came out with this so-called advertisement.
Bullying.
The Me Too movement against sexual
Toxic
harassment.
masculinity.
Is this the best a man can get? Is it? We can't hide from it.
Sexual harassment is taking over.
It's been going on far too long. We can't laugh it off.
Who's the daddy?
What I actually think she's trying to say.
Making the same old excuses.
Boys will be boys. Boys will be boys. Boys will be boys.
But something finally changed.
Allegations regarding sexual assault and sexual harassment.
But she says
And there will be no going back. Because we believe in the best in men.
Men need to hold other men accountable.
Smile, sweetie.
Come on.
To say the right thing. To act the right way.
Bro, not cool, not cool.
Some already are. In ways big
Yo, men, we're everywhere.
and small.
I am strong.
But some is not enough.
It's not how we treat each other, okay? Okay.
Because the boys watching today will be the men of tomorrow.
Now, just days before that advertisement aired, the American Psychological Association issued new guidelines for the psychological practice with boys and men. This is their official set of guidelines. Granted, the APA is just a horribly slanted organization, and yet they have the prestige of the profession, and all these psychologists or members who are largely feminists, whether they're female or male. But they issue these guidelines for the psychological practice with boys and men, warning that traditional masculine traits are linked to aggression and negative health outcomes. So this guide defines traditional masculinity as, quote, a particular constellation of standards that have held sway over large segments of the population, including anti-femininity, achievement, eschewal of the appearance of weakness, and adventure, risk, and violence. They also said, and I quote, traditional masculinity marked by stoicism, competitiveness, dominance, and aggression is, on the whole, harmful. And then I don't need to belabor the point here. We all know that across the entertainment industry, men are being portrayed, or long have been portrayed as lazy, incompetent, stupid. They're the punching bag for jokes. They're another child for mom to manage. You've got Al Bundy and Married with Children, Homer Simpson. You get Hal and Malcolm in the Middle, Peter Griffin and Family Guy, Ray and Everybody Loves Raymond, Daddy Pig and Peppa Pig, Phil and Modern Family, like on and on and on and on and on, right? And that stereotype matters because it reinforces the attack on men. Across, I'm not going to get too much into the data points. I share a lot more in the book, but for example, in 1960, 17.5% of children lived apart from their fathers. Today, that number has surged to over 1/3 of all children, or 25 million kids are growing up without their biological father. And that contributes to a cascade of downstream social degeneracy. You've got, fatherless children experiencing poverty at 4 times the rate of kids with married parents. Children without a present father are far more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol. Fatherless daughters are 4 times more likely to get pregnant as teenagers. Kids raised without a father are more than twice as likely to commit suicide. So, and millions more children, many more, tens of millions of children, are fortunate to have a father who's physically present, but in many cases, he's emotionally absent. So an intact family is not necessarily a strong family. There's plenty of dads who are just, beat down and overworked or addicted or, whatever their problems, and it's not a strong family. But there's all kinds of other problems. I mean, sperm counts are dropping. Some people call this spermageddon. In fact, that was the conclusion of an author, a researcher who did a meta-analysis of 223 research studies published clear back from 1873 to 2018. So 223 studies. The survey of this data included a total of 57,000 men in 53 countries, found that in the last half century, total sperm counts dropped by 62.3%. I need to go back and look at that. I wonder if 1873 was a typo. That might be 1973. So I doubt that they were analyzing sperm in 1873. So I will look into that. Okay. So you got sperm that's on a decline, right? Testosterone following a similar trend. In fact, the most prominent study on that topic revealed a substantial drop in the testosterone levels of men in the U.S. since the 1980s, with a 1% drop every year. So one reporter pointed out that this means that a 65-year-old man in 2002 would have testosterone levels 15% lower than those of a 65-year-old in 1987, right? So you get this plummeting of testosterone. Here's another parade of horribles, right? Men are 22% more likely to abuse illicit substances than women, 3 times more likely to regularly consume pornography. Boys are at least twice as likely to be diagnosed with ADHD as girls, twice as likely to be suspended in school. School dropout rates for boys are much higher than girls. You take the top 10% of a high school class, only 1/3 will be boys. Girls get better grades, graduate at higher rates. I mean, all of this contributes to what I mentioned in the book is often called the male drift, where young men develop this like deep-seated apathy almost about education, employment, personal health, marriage, life in general, right? This male drift. So anyway, so the introduction of the book, I kind of say, here's the landscape that our boys are growing up in, that we men are operating in, where our very innate masculinity is and long has been under attack and blamed for all kinds of social and political ills. And the narratives that's being inculcated in men and boys today and reinforced across all of society's powerful institutions is that it's, men's fault. No wonder there's disengagement. No wonder there's so-called male drift. So in that environment, in today's world, what does it mean for men of God to rise up? And so, as I said, I take the lyrics of William Merrill's hymn and I break it apart into a book-length treatment of this topic. So, for example, he says, "Rise up, O men of God, have done with lesser things." So my first chapter is called The Lesser Things. And so I review what are some of those lesser things. What are the lesser things that we need to rise up above? And so one of the stories that I share comes from Screwtape Letters, right? So if you haven't read it, C.S. Lewis, there's a senior demon mentoring his apprentice Wormwood. And through that conversation of this senior devil educating and tutoring a young devil, C.S. Lewis is helping us understand that the most effective methods of damnation isn't always some big overt act of evil or big sin or grand temptation. Instead, it's the slow, steady drift into complacency and mediocrity that ensnares men. So Screwtape writes, "Indeed, the safest road to hell is the gradual one, the gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without milestones, without signposts." And so in Lesser Things, in this chapter, I talk about, how small sins matter less by their size than by their cumulative effect. So the tiny indulgences and diversions that are repeated over time bring men away from God. And throughout Scripture, we have so many examples, right? You've got Israel's idolatry. You've got Nephite, pride after prosperity. Samson and Delilah, David and Bathsheba, Solomon's divided loyalty over and over and over again. It isn't people waking up saying, today I'm going to be evil or I'm going to commit this great sin. It's all these deviations. It's these lesser things. And modern culture is full of them, pacifying men with convenience and entertainment and subtle idolatries, draining time and energy so your stewardship is being frittered away and squandered until the point where we're being bound by what Nephi called flaxen cords. Here's a little snippet of this chapter that I'll read. "Our task is to buck the trend and avoid this fate that has befallen so many of our spiritual peers. Instead of assuming that these clear scriptural patterns don't apply to us, we should frankly consider ourselves the guilty party about whom past prophets have warned. Rather than thinking ourselves righteous while others are spiritually inferior, we should recognize that the Lord's condemnations apply just as much, indeed much more, to us than they do to those who have not received such spiritual privilege. On the final night of his mortal ministry, Jesus broke bread with his disciples and ominously revealed, "One of you shall betray me." It would be natural to be defensive in such a situation. Surely Jesus is talking about someone else, not me. But nobody pointed fingers or asked him if the guilty party was a particular person they suspected. Instead, they were exceedingly sorrowful, and began every one of them to say unto him, "Lord, is it I?" Their questions were personal. They were applying the Savior's prophecy to themselves. We should learn from their example. Too many men today are mired in spiritual mediocrity. We are distracted and our path deviated by lesser things that increase our distance from God. Such men chase after wealth, entertainment, status, or worldly pleasures, believing that these pursuits will bring fulfillment. Or if they haven't consciously sought after these things, they passively pursued them as a result of social conditioning and the traditions of the fathers. They casually follow the crowd in its Babylonian practices, embracing idolatry while convincing themselves that they're still on the so-called covenant path. This self-deception allows men to rationalize their indulgence in lesser things while neglecting their divine potential. Rather than rising up as warriors for truth and righteousness, they're lulled into spiritual sleep, content with superficial worship and worldly pursuits. Remember that the adversary's greatest tool isn't always blatant sin. Distraction and diversion are typically better at eroding faith and compromising God's children. Okay, so that's the chapter on rise up, O men of God, have done with lesser things. And then Merrill says, give heart and soul and mind and strength to serve the King of Kings. So I wanted to take some time with that. What does that actually look like? What does it mean to give our heart to God, our mind, our strength, our soul? You know, the contrast, I think of like the Pledge of Allegiance. You get this like robotic, ritual that is meaningless and hollow that people go through just because it's expected of them or they've always done it. Contrasting to what God actually demands of us. I don't think it's ritual and box checking. It's total internalized devotion. It's not lukewarm discipleship. It's not serving two masters. God wants us to give all of ourself, our heart, our soul, our mind, our strength to him. Right? Worship needs to be lived conviction rather than memorized phrases or going through the motions at church on Sunday. So real discipleship for men of God means full engagement, sincerity, sustained effort. I think of like King Nebuchadnezzar commanding everyone to bow down and worship the golden image, and then the defiance of 3 Jews named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, where they had this strong test of idolatry. God is a jealous God, doesn't want divided loyalty. And back then it was golden calves, and today the idolatry is much more sinister and undetectable. Modern idols, I think, are subtle. They're popular. They're private. They're easy to justify. So what does it look like for us, in a very practical sense, by the way, to give our heart to God, to give our soul to God? How is that any different than giving our heart to God? What does soul mean? Or our mind, from an intellectual, to use our mind and its power in the furtherance of God's kingdom, or our strength, right? We can't go through the, heart and soul and mind and strength, and consecrate ourselves, blah, blah, blah. So I really wanted to just get away from the superficial, yay, we give our whole thing to God. I wanted to break this down. What does it look like to give our soul to God? What does it mean to give our mind to God? Here's a little snippet from this chapter. The Bible says, in its typical exaggerated language, that all the people, the nations, and the languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. This isn't true, of course. Not everyone complied. Among other likely acts of civil disobedience not recorded, we read of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, 3 Jewish men of rank in the Babylonian government, who opted out and boldly told the king, "We will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up." Furious at their disobedience, Nebuchadnezzar had them thrown into the fire where God protected them, surprising the king and prompting him to promote them. We might not always be so fortunate, but the commandment is clear. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. It was the first commandment given through Moses to the rescued children of Israel, who were subsequently told not to bow down or serve these other gods. Having lived for generations in Egypt, a society steeped in polytheism and idolatry, God's chosen people had been surrounded and influenced by a culture that worshipped numerous gods, each with specific forms, powers, and purposes. After centuries in such an environment, the Israelites had become culturally conditioned to a way of life where idolatry was normalized. When God delivered them from bondage, he was not only rescuing them physically, but also spiritually, calling them to a new way of life centered on exclusive devotion to him. This is perhaps best summarized by God's explanation that he is a jealous God, one who's offended when our actions and loyalties are diverted to any degree from him. In any close relationship, as in a marriage or between ourselves and God, we ought to give our heart to the other person. This is a deep emotional commitment based in vulnerability that signifies we're all in. In a spiritual context, this means avoiding at all costs the actions of countless of God's children who were seduced by surrounding cultural beliefs and practices, creating a syncretic religion, one that was rooted in the gospel but intertwined with idolatry. We can't claim to be happily married while having a so-called side chick. No man can serve two masters. What idolatry entices us today? And then I go on to give examples. Okay, so again, and that was from the subsection of that chapter about heart. But what does it mean to give our strength to God? What does that look like? How is that any different? So that's that whole chapter. So then I talk about how this next chapter is the Kingdom Tarries, right? So from the hymn, Rise Up, O Men of God, his kingdom tarries long, bring in the day of brotherhood and end the night of wrong. So what does it mean for God's kingdom to tarry long? So then in the book, I talk about the parable of the bridegroom and the cultural context of, in Jewish society, why this parable made a lot of sense. That in ancient Jewish practice, marriage involved a betrothal, which was the legally binding arrangement, and then a later wedding celebration that could be like months after the betrothal. So that you have this waiting period in the middle where the bride would remain in her father's home while preparations continued. The wedding celebration began when the bridegroom came to be the bride's family home and escort her to his home or to the feast location. And that arrival of the bridegroom was uncertain, often unannounced, so the attendants had to be ready for a sudden call. The virgins, right, represent the young women who would attend the bride. They would go out with lamps to light the way for the bridegroom to come in. Obviously, these lamps have a symbolic angle, but they're also a practical purpose about illuminating the path. Delays in this cultural, practice were normal. So if you only brought enough oil, then you'd run into problems. And the preparedness of those attendants, the young women, would be then visible and consequential. So Christ's audience, when he's giving the parable of the bridegroom, would grasp the social reality of all of this. An honored role, uncertain timing, a practical need for reserves, the shame that would come from being excluded by showing up unprepared. So then Jesus says, watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour wherein the Son of Man cometh. Well, what does that mean for us as men of God if the kingdom tarries long? I share in the book all these examples of, early church leaders trying to predict or prognosticate on when the Lord would come. A lot of people have said the second coming would be before now, and obviously hasn't been. And so what kind of traps do we fall into where, are we really waiting for the second coming? Are we really prepared if Jesus shows up tomorrow? Are we really prepared for the last days events? Do we fall into some sort of paralysis of just ignoring all that stuff? Because what's the point? Because who knows when it is? And there've been all these past attempts to try and predict it and get all up in a tizzy about being, having your food storage and your whatever. And then these dates come and go, and we get tired of always being prepared and always waiting. And right. So I analyze in the book, all these complications that arise from the kingdom tarrying long. Here's a little snippet from the book. The extended delay of Christ's return presents unique challenges. Maintaining consistent, fervent devotion over decades, safeguarding our testimonies against cynicism or wariness, and consistently prioritizing God's purposes amidst daily pressures and the distracting pull of lesser things. Overcoming these challenges demands intentional, sustained effort. How then do we as men sustain our spiritual urgency without succumbing to fatigue or complacency? Christ himself provided the foundational principle. Watch, therefore, for ye know not what hour your Lord doth come. For men especially, vigilance resonates deeply, as many naturally understand the importance of guarding what they value, be it family, home, or livelihood. Vigilance in our spiritual lives similarly requires active attentiveness and deliberate effort. Christ repeatedly exhorted his disciples to watch and pray, underscoring that spiritual vigilance is not passive or infrequent. And without intentional watchfulness, the distractions of daily life will erode our spiritual awareness, leaving us vulnerable to complacency. Too often, well-intentioned saints drift gradually from the straight and narrow, mistakenly assuming their departure is temporary and return will be easy. This way lies spiritual death. Active vigilance does not have to cause anxiety or stress. True vigilance is disciplined, balanced, and naturally woven into daily life, uplifting rather than burdening us. Just as regular physical exercise builds endurance and strength, daily spiritual habits like prayer, scripture study, and thoughtful reflection reinforce our spiritual resilience. These practices help us not only endure challenges, but flourish spiritually despite everyday pressures. Because both physical and spiritual growth often take time to become evident, breaking these processes into manageable daily actions can provide clear milestones and steady motivation, keeping us committed and encouraged. So then I go on to talk about what are some of those manageable daily actions and processes that we can focus on as men to try and improve. I'm going to breeze through the remainder of the chapters and not spend a lot of time, any more time, reading snippets like that. But, you go through the rest of Merrill's lyrics, bring in the day of brotherhood and end the night of wrong. Each of those get their own chapter-length treatment in my book. What is the day of brotherhood? What is brotherhood? In the context of the restored gospel, what is the priesthood? This brotherhood. The priesthood power requires men of action, right? Not neutrality. We're to be anxiously engaged. We're to bring to pass much righteousness, not be slothful servants. So what do our quorums look like? Do we operate more like the sleeping giants that President Benson warned about, that if Satan really wanted to neutralize the priesthood, right, he would just pacify us and turn us into sleeping giants? So what does it mean to actually be a brotherhood? What does it mean to actually kind of rise up together as men of God as part of a true brotherhood? And in so doing, then what does it mean as part of that brotherhood to end the night of wrong? What is the night of wrong? So in this chapter, I talk about sacred combinations, Lucifer's minions, how he operates, the war in heaven, how it continues today, how we're commanded to waste and wear out our lives, bringing to light hidden things of darkness. Men of God are not just supposed to oh, yay, I go to work and I pay my bills and I love my kids and I minister and I pay my tithing, the end, we lived happily ever after. Men of God are called to rise up above those lesser things and to actually, initiate action to build God's kingdom, to end the night of wrong, as William Merrill said. And it has scriptural basis, even though he's a, different denomination, right? And the Doctrine and Covenants, as I said, that we're commanded to waste and wear out our lives, bring into light hidden things of darkness wherein we know them and they're truly manifest from heaven. We're commanded to awake and arise again and again and again, awake to our awful situation because of secret combinations. We're supposed to bring light and truth to a world filled with darkness and end the night of wrong. Because many people are trying to search for the truth and they don't know where to find it. We are supposed to be the ones to spread that light and truth. And then, of course, the omitted third verse, I'm not going to dig into this. I'd rather leave it for the book, for you to see kind of my thesis about why it may have been omitted from the hymnal for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But I have a whole chapter about this concept William Merrill talked about, which is the church for you doth wait, her strength unequal to her task will rise up and make her great. What does that mean? What does that look like? Does it apply to members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? So, a little tease to go get the book for yourself or the men in your life. As I say in the introduction, or maybe it's the preface of the book, pretty much everything in the book is for all of God's children and applies just as much to women, especially all of God's commandments and encouragements. But I do think in the context of the day in which we live, where masculinity is under attack and men have largely become neutralized, I think focusing the calls to action and focusing the message on men is critical, hence my book. The concluding chapter that I write about is based off of the last verse from the hymn, lift high the cross of Christ, tread where his feet have trod. as brothers of the Son of Man, rise up, O men of God. So what does it mean to tread where Jesus's feet have trod? In this chapter, I talk about how, Christ was really countercultural. We imagine this pacified, sanitized, nice Jesus. And I've talked about this in past musings. For any faithful listener of this podcast, this is not new, or serious scriptorian, right? This is not new stuff. When Jesus in Luke 12 says, "Suppose ye that I am come to give peace on earth, I tell ye nay, but rather division." Like, that is totally in conflict with the nice Jesus, the teddy bear Jesus, as some call it, that people have portrayed. Or in Matthew 10, "Think not that I am come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword." Like, yeah, unity is the ideal, but truth is paramount, and truth divides. The guilty take of the truth to be hard, for it cutteth them to the very center. So where Jesus has trod, for us as men of God to tread where Jesus trod, is ourselves to be countercultural, is to flip over tables and braid whips, not to be aggressors in any sense of the word, but not to just be these pacified, feminized, whatever, like, we're not contentious. And like, no, we need to contend for the truth. I have a whole musing a few months ago on that, right? That we need to be righteously contentious. So there's plenty of scriptures to substantiate that. That treading where Jesus trod is not just the lovey-dovey stuff. Jesus has this whole countercultural, complex, bold side that I think is very consistent, particularly with the calls to waste and wear out our lives, bring the light in things of darkness, and so forth. That he calls us to rise to that fight and that righteous contention to stand for truth in a world filled with lies, to stand up in a sit-down world. So treading where Jesus trod doesn't just mean baking casseroles for your neighbor and, mowing someone's lawn. Like, yes, it means that and a lot more, but it means a lot more too. And so in this chapter, I lay out examples of where I think men of God need to rise up in order to truly tread where Jesus trod. This has been a long time coming. In fact, this book I started probably over 2 years ago. I got about a quarter way in, and then I hit pause on it because I realized I wanted to write The Slow Stain. So I started that book because that had a particular deadline. I wanted to get that book out on the 30th anniversary of when President Hinckley in 1995 announced the proclamation and said that, we have the tendency to take on the slow stain of the world. And so that book having a deadline, I shifted to get that one done and written and out on time, and then turned back to writing this book. I'm glad it worked that way, because in the intervening time, a lot of these ideas were kind of marinating, and I was observing and reading a lot more. And I think the end product became a lot better because of the protracted amount of thinking time that I had. So I hope you enjoy. I hope you pick up a copy of the book. In particular, I should have, I debated whether to do this, but I decided not to, just for length, and also to have a little, not give away too much. But the conclusion of the book is where I express a lot of concern about what's happening with men and boys in the church today, the LDS, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And, I talk about Boy Scouts, and I talk about current quorums and goals and activities and the structural challenges that the church faces with its boys today in 2026. It's not new, of course, to 2026. This has been going on for a number of years, but it's not going well. And I have some thoughts on that, which I share in the conclusion. So I'd say for any teen boy and up, this would be a good book, particularly for the adults. So for you ladies listening, for husbands and dads and sons and uncles and nephews and whatever, encourage you to get a copy of the book. Hope you enjoy it. It's been a labor of love. I think it's a message that is sorely needed for our day and age. So again, you can go to Amazon, search Rise Up Connor Boyack, you'll find it. You can also go to socialharmony.org is where you can find this and all my other religious books. Hope you guys enjoy. Have a great Easter Sabbath, and I will see you next Sunday.